All right. And you can imagine what's going to happen. At first, it's going to be 50, 60, 70, 80, 90% of the crop will have to go for their rent. And here's the thing, too. The landlords don't want food. They want a crop they can sell for a profit. Most importantly, cotton. Now, I don't know if you know this, but you can't eat cotton. Let me rephrase that. You can eat it. It's just not terribly filling. And so with that, they're going to have to borrow even more, which is going to lead to even more debt and even more debt. So they're going to be completely trapped in debt. And one of the most important laws that's going to be created after Reconstruction will end will be that everyone will say, no one can move until you repay that debt. You can't move. And that debt will be passed on to your family and so on. So that debt sticks with you, and you can't move until the debt is paid. Meaning, when are they ever going to be able to leave their land? Never. Until they're kicked off, essentially. Which will happen when mechanization will start hitting in the late 1930s. Then they'll just be kicked off and with nothing. Yes?
This kind of sounds like a serf of some sort.
Exactly! Good. They're essentially serfs. And this being tied to the land by debt is this goes back to ancient Sumeria. I know you're wondering, when are you going to get to Samaria, to Mesopotamia? Once again, I made it. And this crisis of what to do about that. Now, this refers to, this map was made with reference to really the South to emphasize freedmen and their descendants. But it's also going to be poor whites too. This is just really hammers the poor, but a significant number, in fact, the vast majority of freedmen are going to be in this class. Yeah. Serfs are people in feudal Europe, medieval Europe, that are bound to land by debt. So they're not quite slaves, but they are. The landlord tells them exactly what to grow and everything. In fact, by the turn of the century, they're going to simply call them the labor and treat them as trapped labor. And by the way, laws will be set up to make sure this was happening. Now, of course, will they be able to vote? We'll get to that to make sure that law doesn't change, to keep them trapped in debt. But there'll be sharecroppers all over the United States. And this would be a way, just basically trapping the poor. And so when my great-great-grandfather and great-grandfather, they broke in the farming disaster of 1919, 1920, south of Omaha, Nebraska, near Louisville, Nebraska, as they call it there, they lost their farm and became sharecroppers. They would eventually lose the whole thing. They'd be kicked off the land in 1945. My dad was born on that farm. And so my dad literally was born on a sharecropper's farm. They couldn't afford a hospital, and that's just the way it was. And so, it's a connection to my family. And this probably is connections to a lot of different families. And so with that, it's no coincidence that once you have sharecropping in that system, they want to keep it going. The best way to keep it going would be a series of laws that eventually would be dubbed Jim Crow laws, or simply Jim Crow. And these are segregation laws to segregate the South. Black and white, but also poor, rich and poor, or rich and middle class / poor, against poor. And by the way, Jim Crow was a minstrel show from the 1850s, kind of like Dixie was a minstrel song, done in the urban North. That's kind of these caricatures of the South and mocking the South. But eventually that name would be given to the laws by the 1890s. So simply just Jim Crow meant segregation. And here is this horrible racialized caricature of Jim Crow. This little button, Jim Crow button. It's mind-boggling. But segregation was basically saying that blacks could not participate in the commercial goings-on, the commercial part of the economy. They couldn't do normal sales, they couldn't buy and sell, they couldn't participate in the market. So by definition, they're always going to be second class, not only second class by what they can participate, but also economically. Because they will not be able to participate in the normal avenues of the economy. And this is a big deal because the federal government decides the financial system, they make the rules, they create the currency, they set up interstate commerce. And the federal government then is complicit in saying, okay, a massive percentage of the population of the South, but also is outside the South too. Jim Crow's laws would spread to the North. And they cannot participate in normal society. And here's a couple examples of the segregation. I just use these to give you like very concrete examples that people think about. But I want to be clear about it. The big thing is they can't participate in the economy. I should add, in economies of scale, who has the competitive advantage? Big. Well, it works here too. If one group is allowed to accumulate wealth and the other group isn't, they will have a competitive advantage, and they will pass that on to their children, and so on and so on. The difference will accelerate. Here are a couple different examples of this. And I chose these because this is always one of the more stellar ones. This is up to the, it says colored admission, but it's a movie theater, the cheap seats at the top of the theater. Here is the white Coca-Cola dispenser from the 1940s. But this is the one that always gets to me. It says showers, white officers, colored officers. When was that? That's World War II. So here the United States is claiming that we're fighting against ultimate racism that is fascist or Nazi Europe, even though that was kind of an allergy. That wasn't the real reason, but that's what they claim we're fighting for, and that's the United States Army. Segregated. So there's a lot of contradictions here that stem from Jim Crow. By the way, that would not end in the U.S. Army until Harry Truman, 1948. Got rid of segregation. And other parts about this is the biggest element of this goes back to sharecropping. All the debt restrictions that are going to come on with sharecropping. All these debt subscriptions to restrict movement. You don't have freedom until you pay back the debt. By the way, who writes the laws? The creditors or the debtors? Who? Yeah, the creditors. The creditors write the law. They have the power. They rig it for them. And anybody who might break that, they'll sweep them up and arrest it. And to enforce this, areas that have these kind of laws have to, by definition, kind of become a police state. The police have got to be strong. Modern police forces, we know, would begin in New York City, various places for lots of reasons, partially to stop Christmas, but would really expand in the South. Really expand. And it ties into what amendment, or the 13th Amendment said who can still be enslaved? Prisoners, exactly, criminals. And so there'd be sweeps to pick up criminals as part of Jim Crow laws and set up what they call the convict lease system, where prisoners would be swept up and then literally sold as slaves until their term is done to various things like farms, cities. Here they're on the railroad, working on a street for a private company within the street. That's in Birmingham. Now, this would happen all over, but it would be endemic in the South. And it would be, yes, a lot of African Americans, but also poor whites. And they just would sweep up men. Just sweep them up. They get a quota in police departments. You need this many people. We got people ready to pay. And the 13th Amendment said they could be slaves. By the way, having slaves, prisoner slaves, do jobs, what does that do to wages for people who are not prisoners, for free people? Drops their wages. If you got to compete with a prisoner or a slave, your wages will drop. Yeah.
So these people were arrested, right? And this, how often do they actually do this? Just arrested like
You know, who knows the exact number, but a significant number. There would be so many just arrested for vagrancy. You're loitering and not doing anything. How do you define that? So you're standing in the street, boom, arrested. Scoop them up. And so that's always this constant fear of arrest, you can imagine. And a very confidential relationship between police and the poor, but especially of blacks. Also, voter suppression. Now, voter suppression isn't technically part of Jim Crow, but it relates. These are laws. The rules are being rigged, and how do you change them? To vote. But if you can't vote, you can't change the laws. And so, the goal was to destroy the Republican vote in the South. And so it's not just trying to make sure that black men can't vote, but it's also poor whites can't vote. Scoop them all in. Because poor whites are also victims to the same system. Remember, you don't want them to vote, but they do, make sure they vote kind of that Bacon's Rebellion thinking. And the biggest way is that picture shows a little ham-handed, but what the heck? Terror and violence. People voted in public, you get roughed up if you voted. And this would be all over, but especially in the South, when Reconstruction ended. But then the Mississippi Plan. The 15th Amendment left good holes. So you can pass laws that would apply to everybody, but written in such a way that they really only apply to one or two groups. Then they could destroy the right to vote. This is legal voter suppression. And what they said was, by allowing freedmen to vote, now I'm talking 1870s, 1880s, this led to massive fraud. They were corrupt, they would be bribed, they're ignorant about the American system, and so they claimed voter fraud. There's all this fraud. Was there fraud? Maybe a little. But the best way to suppress the vote is to say there's a lot of fraud. There's fraud, so we must stop fraud. How do you stop fraud? By keeping people from voting. And the first thing they would do is jack up the poll tax. A poll tax. This was literally a tax that every eligible voter must pay. If you don't pay it, you can't vote. Well, meaning, if you have a poll tax, and the tax is high enough to bite some people, who will be able to vote? Poor people, which includes a significant number, almost all the freedmen, and a lot of poor whites. This would be found, or the Supreme Court would be, the Constitution would be amended in 1963 to ban the poll tax. But there are other ways around it. You can find another way for voters to spend money, and that'll keep poor people from voting. Big cities, 20 to 30% of the population, they don't have driver's license because they don't drive. So you make them get a driver's license to vote. It's kind of an indirect poll tax. But the biggest one was called the Grandfather's Clause. You might have heard of this, the idea that if the law changes, you can still kind of be, how about the grandfather? Somebody used to saying it, but you can still go by the old law because it applied to you before the change. Well, what it said was this: everybody must pass a literacy test, unless this applies to everybody, unless your grandfather couldn't vote. Unless your grandfather could vote. Everybody must do a literacy test unless your grandfather could vote. That applies to everybody, right? So it gets around the 15th Amendment, at least at first. Eventually, the Supreme Court would throw it out, but by then. Has everyone got that? Everybody must pass a literacy test unless their grandfather can vote. That means who's going to do the literacy test? Especially immigrants or the descendants of slaves. Exactly. This makes sure that almost all black people would have to take a literacy test. And the literacy test, don't think it in terms of like writing or literature or things like that. It's your knowledge of government. The literacy test is your knowledge of government. Because the idea was they could say, there's voter fraud because the descendants of slaves don't know anything about government, so they must prove they know about government. And the test be written so who could pass it? Nobody. Nobody can pass these tests. They are so shockingly hard. So I know this stuff. I follow this stuff. I remember a few years ago when I took the 1955 Alabama literacy test, and I think I got like an 85%. Or something that should be in my area, It's like something, I know this is what I study. And so I can't even imagine how poorly other people would have done. Most people couldn't have passed the test, but their grandfathers could vote, so they don't have to take it. Meaning most white people did not. That means the people administering the test probably, almost certainly, would have failed the test. Do you see how that is written? So what happened very quickly? All the other states followed the Mississippi plan for the grandfather's clause. And what happened to the number of, you come on now with a poll tax and intimidation, how many blacks could vote in the South, states in the former Confederacy by 1900? More than that. A lot more. A lot more. About 2%. And most of them are in Kentucky and Virginia. A few in North Carolina, and we'll get to what's going to happen in North Carolina. Yeah.
Is that the year 1900?
Yeah, by 1900. By 1900, 2%. Approximately. And so how do you ever change Jim Crow if the voters can't change? And these are state laws. Now, what amendment does this skip around? Yeah, the 15th. How about Jim Crow laws? What amendment does that appear to skip around? 14th. And there will be a court case about that. Now, that one is just like, wow. One thing about judges, they are political beings. They make political decisions. You know, they're not like impartial umpires. They're just as political as anybody else. By the way, never trust anybody who says this isn't political. Do not trust them because it's political. So there's another thing going on too. There's a big economic divide that already exists in the South. Wealthy planters in the South had unified with Northern monopolists. Northerners who want to create monopolies in business. And why do they organize? Keep wages low. Keep farm workers low, keep workers in the North low. I mean, they unify. So you have Southern Democrats unifying with Northern Republicans. Northern Democrats are kind of all over the place. The Democratic Party, because of this divide that's happened North and South, is going to be a very divided and confusing party. That will end, we'll see. And so with that, and so there's a lot of inequality. But the goal is to keep wages low. That's the thing, keep wages low. Which, by the way, is the essence of laissez-faire economics we talked about, Hamiltonian economics, the basis in the 20th century of conservative economics. Keep wages low for most workers. But what does that mean? Well, a lot of people, poor workers in the South, they had cause to unify with Republicans who are mostly black, the few that could vote. That's going to lead to a series of parties called this divide will lead to a series of groups they'll call fusion parties, where populist whites, poor white Democrats, and black Republicans will unify. And they'll actually call them fusion. I didn't really write this very well. I was thinking about it, and I didn't write it as quickly as I should, but they're fusion parties. They're populist. Populist is a term mixed up all the time, but it's basically this idea of how do you help average people? You get a lot of elites trying to take advantage of this, but they unify. And this is from the 1790s. And this was the last gasp of a kind of a reconstruction idea of this they call, what you basically call multiracial democracy. And by the way, here's an example of Missouri trying to bash the fusion party by saying they're bribing black voters and poor citizens. By the way, you notice who the citizens are in Missouri are being harmed. They don't hide what they think. And this is going to lead to, eventually by the 1890s, the end of the multiracial democracy that was attempted. Reconstruction, trying to create this democracy of all people. And this would be the final end. So there'd be a fusion party victory all over the South, especially North Carolina. Poor white farmers, poor white laborers, mixed in with mostly black Republicans, just the way the racial divide worked. And you can imagine how the planters elite who ran the newspaper were furious. This is a cartoon from, this is a Georgia newspaper. And it shows a voter in the ballot box, and it says fusionist, and you notice the fusionist is a devil. Nothing more satanic than having people of different races unify, according to that. And the claim was this will bring back the black misrule. So that is a cartoon from a newspaper in North Carolina. And that is a shocking one. You see this a lot when it talks about Reconstruction. I've seen this actually in a couple of documentaries about Reconstruction. It's actually about the attack on the Fusion Party. But it's all those caricatures I showed you before. You notice that it's kind of the wings, kind of satanic or a devil. And they're scooping up, and you can see the color of the skin. There's the ballot box. And this was in a Wilmington, North Carolina newspaper telling whites, we better do something about this. We can't allow, because they actually took over, the fusionists took over a town. And that's going to lead to the 1898 Wilmington, North Carolina insurrection. And the reason I'm mentioning this, you think, why Wilmington, North Carolina? Because this would set the precedent all over the South. White mob, they called themselves red shirts. I know it's hard to tell, but a lot of these men have red shirts. Came out in Wilmington, North Carolina, armed to the teeth, and attacked the duly elected government of Wilmington and overthrew it. Just overthrew it. A number of people were killed. Now, this is what the New York Herald said. The New York Herald actually was, for the time, relatively open to a multiracial democracy. The whites killed Negroes and seized the city of Wilmington. They literally overthrew the government and imposed a new government. But this is what one of the newspapers in North Carolina said. The blacks to blame. There's no doubt that Negroes were responsible for the precipitating the race war, which is not at all what happened. But the big thing about this was, this led to the end of the fusion governments, white rule, which means what's the only party then? That the fusion party was destroyed. Democratic rule, and this ended fusion all over the South. There'd be big riots in Atlanta, big riots in Birmingham, whites attacking fusionists, mostly blacks, and it ended that. So that's why 1900 it's over. It said 9 shot down. The number is probably closer to 30. Yeah, guns are going to have a big part about this, weapons. Even though the gun culture today is a heck of a lot different than it was even 15 years ago. And that's going to lead to the creation of the Solid South. That's going to last until 1964, when the states of the former Confederacy are Democratic, period. They vote Democratic. And so even liberal Democrats, much more liberal than any president we've had since Lyndon Johnson, but here's John Kennedy, very liberal president. He has to go down to the South and kind of straddle the line. Here he is in Georgia. Yes, Georgia put the Confederate battle flag on their flag to show they're opposed to civil rights. A lot of states did that. Also, they started sticking the Confederate battle. This is the 1950s. And so they had to walk this line. But it would begin to break up. In 1948, Southern Democrats walked out on Harry Truman because he proposed ending Jim Crow laws. And so some Southern states voted for a third party. They called them the Dixiecrat government. And then in '64, the Republican Party came out against the Civil Rights Act, and that's when this would change. When the Republican Party came out against the Civil Rights. So there'll be a big flip-flop on that. Not so much. Northern Democrats were for civil rights. The party was very divided. Why? So this is the New South. And the NADAR racism happened about 1900 to about 1940. This is the most racist time in history. Worldwide. Worldwide. It's no coincidence you have the scientific revolution of the late 19th century, the Second Industrial Revolution, colonization, the end of the Civil War, And a lot of it would be personified. That's why I put these two pictures up here. Remember, lynching is torturing to death, but most of the time we associate that with hanging. And look at that picture on the left. I mean, they got the whole family out there to witness hanging. They're dressed well, too. They got ties on. The other one on the right, that's they lynched him and then burnt the body. And there'd be lots of reasons, but generally having to do with voting rights, sometimes with could be dating or things like that, but the big thing was voting rights. And this would become one of the symbols. There were lynchings all over the United States, especially areas where there might be a migration of blacks or other immigrants. So Montana had a lot of lynchings. Some were black, some were Chinese immigrants, some were American Indians. There were some in Helena, when the city of Helena, when the Klan reemerged and they ran Chinese immigrants and blacks out of Helena. Just about 20% of the population were either blacks or Chinese, and in about 5 years we're down to about 1%. Yeah.
Does lynching only apply to people of color?
No, individually lynched. So there are a number of lynchings of other people who might have supported it. This map, this picture right here, is done by the NAACP, so it's based upon mostly. And I don't know why Utah none. I can't imagine it would be that much different, but I'm always like, everyone noticed that. You probably noticed that too. Some of you did. And there are a lot. My mom and dad remember the story that their parents, my grandma and grandpa, about one in Omaha, Nebraska, lynching. There's a bunch in Omaha, Nebraska. And do you want to see it? They have a picture of the one that they remember. Well, I'm going to show you it. It's pretty shocking. Oops. That was in Nebraska. I'll tell you about another one later. 1922? I don't know on top offhand. The lynching in that context, that was until the 1930s. I know of an example of a couple of Northern Cheyenne who were tortured to death in Forsyth, Montana, in the 1960s. So, what are the 14th Amendment? Plessy versus Ferguson. This court case, Homer Plessy would be arrested for sitting in the white section of a segregated cars on the Southern Pacific Railroad. And this would go to the Supreme Court. And what was the issue? Plessy and his defenders were saying that Jim Crow laws, especially segregated rail cars that cross state lines, violates the 14th Amendment and therefore civil rights. Now, Plessy's got a lot of his money came from the Southern Pacific Railroad. They didn't want to pay for separate rail cars. Went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court, in one of the most amazing readings of the 14th Amendment possible, said, it's fine. You can do that. As long as they're, and you might have heard of this, separate but equal are constitutional. Separate but equal. So if you ever heard that term before, this is where it comes from. One of the most shocking readings of the 14th Amendment possible. Because this goes against the very intent of the 14th Amendment. But let's be very clear. The way we have set up the system in the United States, especially after the Civil War, the Supreme Court has basically given itself the power to make rulings like this. And so we're stuck with their political point of view. It has never been fully overturned, just bits and pieces of it. And by the way, was it equal? Of course not. But more importantly, why were they separate? This is the big out. Even if they're equal, why are they separate? Because of racism. Because of this concept that one race is inferior to another race. And that, by definition, makes it unequal. This is why they'll get, this is when they'll start to overturn this. Most famously, Brown versus the people born of education. Yeah.
So would this still be like part of, like, where you have the
poor whites who are poor, but they still have that over.
That is such a good point. Poor whites don't have much, but if they can ride on that train, they can ride with wealthy white people. We have that little bit. And that means a lot. If you don't have much, it's nice to have something. What else you got? What opportunities people take advantage of that. And, yeah, that's a really good point. By the way, Homer Plessy was finally pardoned by the state of Louisiana last week. Now, he's been dead for 100 years, but he was pardoned. That's Louisiana's way of saying, see, we're good people now. And there's good and bad, but that's what they're trying to do. So with that, and this is where we get to the concept of the lost cause. This is a change in thinking that's going to come about after the Civil War. The lost cause. That the Civil War was actually really a noble fight. By whom? Who was fighting the noble fight? Which section? The South. The South was fighting this noble cause. It wasn't about slavery. It was about states' rights. It was states' rights. They were just trying to defend themselves and say, you start seeing the same things like, we didn't want the tariff anymore, which is amazing. Or we didn't want to be under the boot of northern banks. And that's when you start seeing it called, this was a battle, a fight of northern aggression. The North did it. They didn't have to go to war. Now, of course, this would have been a shock to everybody in 1861 who knew if a state seceded, it's civil war, or the United States was done. They all knew it. They knew what they were doing. They were starting civil war, and they thought they could win. King Cotton diplomacy, fighting on the defensive, they thought they could win. And this is when you start getting this term, war between the states. 1880s, 1890s, to imply just a bunch of states and northern states attacked. And that's where you start getting the kind of glorification of, this is a song called I'm a Good Old Rebel, which is actually kind of a catchy tune, but it's about where I'm not going to be reconstructed by you. And this is one of the many monuments that are going to be made in the 1880s and 1890s to the lost cause, Confederate monuments. And this is where you start seeing the Confederate battle flag would just appear all over. And the Confederate battle flag, this is in front of the Capitol in South Carolina, state capitol. And it would appear out in front of the Capitol, flying from the Capitol in 1880, and it would be flying there up until about 10 years ago, where they did finally take this battle flag down and put it behind the Capitol, but it still flies. And that became the symbol of it, and that's where you get this Confederate battle flag. And that became a symbol of the lost cause, aka states' rights. And what that meant is you're pro-Jim Crow. And so the battle flag would kind of dissipate a little bit in the years of the Great Depression and World War II, but it would return with a vengeance when there was efforts to get rid of Jim Crow laws and have civil rights. Also, the battle flag would reappear. And here are people with the battle flag. And this is one of the most famous civil rights marches. We'll talk about it. They sell much to Montgomery March, which will lead to the Voting Rights Act. Just a little bit to finish tomorrow, a little bit of the West. I'm going to post them. It'll be on Teams. The changes I made to the list. Everyone got that? It'll be fun. I'm going to give you everything you need to know. I want everyone to get 1,000% on this test. And that's your choice, 1,000% or 0.
I was talking to my grandma the other day, and it was 78, and I was talking about learning in this class. Telling me about the Civil War and stuff, and she's like, for the longest time, I always thought that was about states' rights because that's what they taught me in school. Yeah. But then it took until I married Grandpa in 1969, because he taught about the Civil War in the military for a while. Yeah. Like he knows so much, and it's crazy. That she realized, oh my God, it was actually about slavery, not states' rights.
She's not,
it was weird because it was just like, I don't know, it's just interesting how their perspective was it when they were in school.
Well, that's still taught in most places. What I taught you here is not taught. None of bias himself.
Because he can't accept that other people know things. We've been arguing since the seventh grade. And
Well,
I'm just like,
I do have bias.
I know because you're a person. That's what I said. I'm like, he's a regular person. He's gonna, of course, he's gonna have a bias. I know bias, but he's not bias. He's like, no. And I was like, I know. Thank you.
See you tomorrow.